People around the world who inject drugs use a wide variety of needles and syringes that vary in size and depending on what drug they're using, and the needles vary depending on where on their body they're injecting. And so some needles, people, also some syringes have needles that are removable, and people really prefer that. So anyway, there's reasons why people use a wide variety of needles and syringes. And so, that at this conference you've heard a lot about biomedical interventions such as ART, PrEP, male circumcision, and those work by reducing the probability of HIV transmission associated with an exposure. And they don't work by reducing risk behaviors. Okay, so if you look at these two syringes, you'll see that one of them retains a lot more fluid than the other one. And that could be blood, it could be wasted drug, but if it's blood, that probably the probability of transmission associated with sharing that is greater than the probability of transmission associated with the one that you don't see anything in. So I'm just going to go over this. I'm going to present a little bit of scientific evidence and then talk about our advocacy efforts and what we've done, the barriers we've encountered and how we've overcome them to move towards implementing a structural intervention to change people from using what I call high dead space syringes to low dead space syringes. And the biological basis for all this is that viral burden influences the probability of HIV transmission associated with an exposure. And we hear a lot about viral load, but we don't talk too much about viral burden, but the amount of virus in an exposure is a function of the volume of the inoculum and the viral load. And so together these syringes work by reducing the volume of inoculum or blood in exposure. And here you can see that an acute infection sharing a high dead space syringe retains about 1 microliter of blood would expose somebody to 10,000 viral particles, whereas sharing a low dead space syringe would expose somebody to 10 copies of HIV. And if you look during latent stage infection, that a person that sharing a high dead space syringe would lead to an exposure of about 10 copies of HIV, whereas only 1 in 100 sharing episodes would lead to exposure to even 1 copy. And so based on this, we did an ecological study. These are just some real preliminary results that to see if HIV prevalence among IDUs or among people who inject drugs varied depending on the types of syringes that they use. And here you can see one thing, most of this was cities across Europe and Asia, and almost all of them, all the cities, people used the high dead space syringes. And HIV prevalence, as you can see, was most of those cities had prevalence over 10%, whereas in the 7 cities where people used mostly low dead space syringes, only 1 city had prevalence over 10%. And so we developed a mathematical model to look at this, and we found that in the hypothetical mathematical model that HIV epidemics wouldn't occur, or they would be reversed if you switch people from high dead space to low dead space needles and syringes. And then we worked with the Futures Institute to plug this into goals models for 5 different countries. And here's an example of what would happen according to the goals model if you switch to people who inject in China from high dead space to low dead space syringes. And the 2 lines, the red line assumes that the probability of transmission is about 125 times lower for exposure to less than 1,000 times less blood. The blue line assumes that the probability of transmission is about 10 times lower. The one thing that you see is that the model is pretty robust, isn't real dependent on the probability of transmission. And so okay, this, we've got a lot more data. I'm not going to present it all right now. But so based on this, we decided to really push push for this, to call attention to this and see if we could bring about a change. So we presented to the US CDC, WHO, UNAIDS, the Global Fund, PEPFAR, and a number of scientific conferences. We have a commentary that will be coming out. It should be online in the International Journal of Drug Policy sometime next month. And so, following our meeting with the Global Fund, they commissioned the Eurasian Harm Reduction Network to conduct a rapid assessment of the syringes used in Europe, in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, and they found that most people across those countries used high dead space syringes. They preferred syringes with detachable needles, and they needed syringes larger than 1 milliliter. So, unfortunately, the low dead space syringes that we've been working with are 1 milliliter and have permanently attached needles. So these syringes aren't acceptable to people who inject in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. So we undertook an effort to look at all the different syringes, look what the different syringe manufacturers offered and see if we could find any other alternatives. And we found there's a couple manufacturers that make some low dead space syringes that use standard needles. And then we found another manufacturer that makes actually low dead space needles that fit on standard syringes. So we got some of these, we did some laboratory experiments, and we concluded that the low dead space syringes with the standard needles retain too much fluid, but the low dead space interchangeable needles were pretty promising. So now we're working with Exchange Supplies in the UK to get these low dead space needles produced at competitive prices and in a wider variety of sizes. And so here's some illustrations. This is a standard needle and syringe. And you can see where the blood would be. Here is the low dead space syringe. It has an elongated plunger that extends into the tip of the syringe, but it still would retain blood in the hub of the needle. Here's the low dead space needle. It reduces most of the dead space, and then here's the low dead space syringe with the permanently attached needle. And here are just pictures of the same things. And you can see over here, here's a standard needle, here's a low dead space needle. You can see the core that goes inside the tip of the syringe. And these work pretty well at reducing dead space. We've since then, now I presented at a regional PEPFAR meeting in Vietnam last November, and since then PSI has conducted a market research study in Vietnam, and they found that most people who inject were using high dead space needles and syringes, and most of them preferred detachable needles and larger syringes. So now PSI is preparing a marketing campaign using social marketing to increase access of PWID across Vietnam to low dead space needles and they're probably going to market both the low dead space needles, syringes with a fixed needle, and the low dead space interchangeable needles. And RTI, where I work, we're trying to get funding to do additional research to actually demonstrate the feasibility of switching people, and then we'll conduct some type of randomized trial to see if we can demonstrate a difference in incidence when we switch people. And so converging scientific evidence from a lot of different experiments and studies suggests that low dead space needles and syringes probably reduce HIV transmission, and it seems like structural interventions to promote this are feasible, and they should be implemented and carefully and rigorously evaluated. And I started a Facebook page called Low Dead Space Syringes where you can get more information on this. And I'd like to acknowledge all the grants I've had over the years, and the people, the staff on one of my projects, and the consultants, and all the other people who have helped me over the last 20-something years. And here's a list of publications and things that I think will be available when this online. So, okay.
Thank you.